It's like, these people are wicked. They deserve to be punished. Due process, constitutional norms, that stuff, who cares? That's like for weak people. But this is like a matter of a strong government punishing the wicked, punishing the bad guys, particularly now in an age of populism and radicalization on both the far left and the far right. Somebody has to stand up for the status quo, right? Somebody kind of has to say, like, are we not the inheritors of something great? Things could obviously always be better, but are things not more good than bad?
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
In this video, I speak with JJ McCullough. He's a professional YouTuber, and JJ has crafted his YouTube channel to aim at a younger audience. So he comes across as hip and cool and lighthearted, but don't be fooled. JJ has a very profound set of messages that he's trying to tackle. So for example, in this video, in our discussion, we talk about gratitude and how gratitude for him is a linchpin of his political philosophy. But how do we work that gratitude out in how we live our lives or in the content that we create? Does gratitude demand that sometimes we need to take action to protect the things we love? If so, what does that action look like? Should government be the one to take action on our behalf to protect the things that we love? If government should take action, how do we avoid tyranny? JJ gets into a number of very, very difficult and profound philosophical issues. So don't be fooled by his young, hip, lighthearted approach. He has a depth to this conversation that you have to listen carefully to appreciate. I hope you enjoy the video. All right, JJ McCullough is a journalist and an award-winning YouTuber with over 1 million followers. He has had a regular column at the National Review and the Washington Post, but he has also been published at most major media outlets in Canada and across the United States. He currently lives in Vancouver. Welcome, JJ.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we're recording this on Monday, March 24th. Prime Minister Mark Carney just called a snap election yesterday. What are your thoughts on that, and what kind of liberal is Mark Carney?
Well, I guess my first thought is that Mark Carney seems like a man who's willing to take risks, because this is a tremendous risk. To call an election after only having been prime minister for 9 days, which means that if it goes badly, I believe he would be the shortest serving prime minister. He would certainly have, one of the most inconsequential reigns as prime minister, basically defined entirely by this election campaign, which he has also chosen to be very, very short. So in that sort of sense, you kind of get a sense of just kind of how ambitious he is, how sort of cocky he is, how confident he is, that he can basically revive the fortunes of a party that really seemed like it was in the dirt by the end of the Trudeau years. And, I think that Mark Carney is a very different sort of man in that sense than the kind of man that we've traditionally had as prime minister. He's a man who sort of comes from this very, exalted background where he has achieved a great deal of things. He has this very substantial resume. He has a sort of track record of, whatever you want to say about it in practice of clearly being trusted with very important offices of in both the private and the public sector. And so I do think that there is a degree to which we are used to, in Canadian politics, I think, underestimating politicians, and often, correctly so, right? A lot of, it's like that line that Churchill said about Clement Attlee, a modest man with lots to be modest about. I think that kind of describes a lot of Canadian politics and Canadian politicians. And so it is interesting to sort of see a prime minister who feels a little bit more sort of confident and sort of gutsy about, what he has to offer, his ability to do what conventional wisdom has said is impossible, which is sort of revive the fortunes of the Liberal Party this late in the game. But the polls suggest that there's reason to be sort of bullish on his chances. He seems like, doesn't seem like a super ideological guy. He seems like, and certainly we've seen this in the degree that he's been willing to sort of crib policy ideas from the Conservatives, or possibly those were his ideas all along, and just realizes that they're good ideas and isn't afraid to sort of, do what is sort of ideologically incorrect based on some sort of dogmatic progressive understanding. And that also feels kind of fresh, because I think that is a sort of restoration of a kind of more pragmatic, capital L liberal tradition, and frankly, something that historically I think a lot of people liked about the Liberal Party, and something that was sort of seen as distinguishing the Liberal Party from the NDP, which is that it was not a completely ideological party. It was more pragmatic. It was certainly more fiscally conservative, more fiscally responsible, sort of more likely to sort of adhere to mainstream economic philosophy when it comes to managing the affairs of the national economy. And but under Trudeau, I think there was a sort of sense that there was this kind of leftist drift and becoming difficult to distinguish, what made the NDP different from the Liberals. And I think Carney is a man who's keen to remind us that there still are substantial differences on the Canadian left, and that there are substantial differences between being, a social democrat and a sort of pragmatic liberal.
So great answer. Do you think he's a Paul Martin liberal?
I think he's definitely closer to that than being a Justin Trudeau liberal, yeah.
Now, if he is a Paul Martin liberal, do you think that'll distance him from the current liberal base? It seems like the liberal voters love the ultra-progressive Trudeau brand.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because the answer would seem to be that the progressives like him, right? Like what we've seen is that the bottom has really sort of felt like it's been falling out of the NDP, right? The Liberal fortunes in the polls have been going up in sync with the NDP going down. So it does sort of suggest that there has been some migration from sort of the more left-wing side of the Canadian political culture towards Mark Carney, even though he seems like, from a sort of orthodox kind of like leftist theory of the world, that he is, the arch sort of like neoliberal technocrat type who people on the far left are supposed to loathe. I guess maybe it sort of says something to the degree that, the era of the so-called Great Awakening is kind of maybe played out a little bit, in the aftermath of Kamala Harris's loss and the rise of Donald Trump again. Maybe there is a kind of sort of understanding in sort of broad sort of progressive culture that pragmatism is necessary, that you cannot be as ideologically dogmatic, certainly on social issues, as you used to be, that there is a certain price that you pay with the electorate when you kind of go in that direction. And at the same time, probably also a sense from the progressive base that you can sort of underestimate the threat that kind of conservative sort of populist type people pose. And I do think that there probably is a willingness or a sort of seriousness and a skepticism of Pierre Poilievre on the left that has sort of reached a much more sort of intense boil. And when that gets to be the case, I think that you probably have some progressive voters who are thinking in a more pragmatic sense, where it's like the sort of the top of ballot issue is now keeping Pierre Poilievre out of power, rather than sort of the pursuit of an ideologically sort of pure domestic agenda.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible for us to know for sure what voters are thinking, but the vibe I get from Carney is almost as though he's wanting to revive the post-war liberal consensus. You mentioned neoliberal. Was it Clinton who said we are all small government people now, or something like that?
Yeah, the era of big government is over. Yeah, this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
So
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird that he would be pulling in that direction. I can't figure it out. So I'll be watching your commentary on it to see if you can figure out what kind of liberal he is. But you mentioned the polls. Can we trust the polls?
I mean, it's all we've got, right? I suppose there's reasons to be skeptical of polls. I mean, polls have been wrong. Obviously, we can all think of examples. And there is a kind of like weird sort of amnesia that I think sort of kicks in. It kind of reminds me of how do you ever notice how like it feels like everybody discovers the weather or the seasons for the first time every year? Like everybody's like, oh man, it's so cold this year. Oh, it's so hot in the summer. Like people just rediscover. And I feel like polling is the same way, right? It's like the polls are never perfect. And then we're after the polls are revealed to be imperfect, we're like, well, we should definitely be a lot more skeptical of polls going forward. And then the next time an election comes around, we just immediately have amnesia and then go back to being credulous again.
Yeah.
Because, on some level, that's just what we have to do to survive, because, we all have a hunger and an appetite for the kind of take-based media ecosystem that relies on sort of polling data in order to form these various narratives that we spout. So, I mean, we're not going to really know, I guess, until election day itself. But I think, based on what we were just sort of saying before, I think there's reasons to believe that we're seeing what we're seeing. A new prime minister, the sort of the Donald Trump threat, I think, is putting voters into a more sort of pragmatic state of mind. And Donald Trump's sort of re-election. I think these are all sort of variables that would explain why certainly a certain cohort of voters would be giving a new liberal prime minister a second look.
Yeah. So just before we jump to Trump, because that's a shiny object that you presented in front of me there, and so we're going to go there for sure. But before we leave polls, I agree with your assessment. It's all we have, and so I think it would be really unwise to pretend that they were completely inaccurate and we shouldn't watch them. But my follow-up question was going to be, do you remember a time, because you follow this way bit more than I do you remember a time when one party was way ahead, so the Conservatives were way ahead, and then their lead collapsed when there was a change? I think, was it John Turner polled really, really high for a while, and then his lead evaporated. I was just reading the Diefenbaker book by Plumont, and he was saying that Diefenbaker was basically just completely decimated in his last election, and everybody said you should never run, and somehow he clawed his way all the way back up to minority status again. So do you ever remember a time when the polls have flipped so dramatically and then have settled back? If you don't remember, that's okay, but I just thought I'd ask.
I don't really remember. I mean, I think that what has happened a lot in the last few decades is that elections on this continent, in both Canada and the US, have just become a lot more stable. Like, I feel like we just conceptualize politics differently. We're more polarized. This is obviously something people talk about all the time. And we're more polarized culturally. And as a result, I think that just makes elections more competitive, but also more sort of stable. The sorts of people who are willing to vote for one party or another are pretty kind of locked in, because, to be on the left, to be on the right, to be a conservative supporter, a liberal supporter, NDP or Democrat, Republican, whatever, like, that is so much bound in a much more sort of it's like stable kind of cultural identity, sense of self, than it was in, Diefenbaker's time, or even in, John Turner's time, or Pierre Elliott Trudeau's time, or whatever, right? At a time when I think people were maybe a little bit more sort of fluid in their political identities. Whereas now, I think, aside from a relatively sort of small faction of people that maybe don't follow politics that closely, I think the idea of sort of going from conservative to liberal just because you kind of like the cut of the new guy's jib or whatever, I think that that's just not really as big a part of our political culture as it was in decades past.
Yeah. So that's fascinating to hear you talk about stability in politics, and we were going to jump into talking about Trump. So I wonder, would you adjust your comment about stability at all? And what are your thoughts on Trump? What kind of conservative is he? Is he a conservative at all? What's going on in the United States?
Well, I mean, I don't like Trump. I made a whole video sort of going on about this at great length. I mean, I think that, Trump is definitely like a man of the right. And I think that one thing that I've been trying to, maybe cut the bologna a little thin on is just this idea of like being a right winger versus being a conservative. Those seem like usefully distinct categories. And at one time, they were considered different categories. At one time, like, to be a right winger, like when Hillary Clinton made her famous line about the vast right-wing conspiracy, like, that was very much intended as a pejorative, because like there was a sort of sense that like to be on the right, it's like to be with like militia people and Timothy McVeigh and fascists and that kind of thing, as opposed to be a conservative, to be William Buckley and Ronald Reagan and Goldwater and all that kind of thing, right? So there was like a kind of clear sort of sense. And I think kind of in one sense what you're seeing in America is sort of the decline of a conservative tradition, a decline of any sort of reverence for that kind of conservative history and conservative philosophy and conservative orthodoxy as embodied by people like Buckley and Reagan and the rest, and towards just kind of like a politics of the right, a politics of a kind of like reactionary impulse that has always existed in every society and is, I think, now manifest in the form of, Trump and certainly the people around him. A good example of this was I saw an interview the other day with the fellow who's the head of Trump's immigration policy. I'm forgetting his name now. Mm-hmm. But, the Trump administration is under a lot of fire right now because they, took all those suspected Venezuelan gang members and sent them to that terrible prison in El Salvador. And then so the news reporter is sort of asking this Trump administration official, it's like, well, what about due process? Did these people get due process before you just rounded them up and sent them to this prison camp? And then the Trump administration guy is like, well, what about the due process for the victims who were killed, right? So it's like, that to me is like a very bluntly kind of like right-wing kind of argument. It's right. It's like, these people are wicked. They deserve to be punished. Due process, constitutional norms, that stuff, who cares? That's like for weak people. But this is like a matter of a strong government punishing the wicked, punishing the bad guys. And there is that kind of right-wing impulse, that sort of reactionary impulse is something that exists in all societies. And there's a lot of desire for it. And what people like, Buckley and even Reagan in the old days kind of had a sense of, which is that a sort of principled conservatism has to be guarded not just against the excesses of the left, but also the excesses of the right. And I think that what you've seen in the rise of Trump and the people around him, people in his administration, people like Hegseth and J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller and these kinds of characters, is that they're not really interested in that kind of moderating impulse of conservatism. They're interested in having a right-wing government that goes after the left, that punishes, illegal immigrants, that punishes criminals. And, if that requires a sort of authoritarian government to do so, to rebuild society in a direction that they see as just, one that can envision a land in which, a certain type of Americans on the top of the pyramid, a certain leftist influence is completely purged from the culture at every level, from the media, from the universities, from Hollywood, from everywhere. They see that as a good thing. And to me, that's just like a very, I think, a somewhat disturbing development in how politics in America has played out. But I think it's important to understand that it is definitely a politics of the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And it reminds me of a couple of your videos, which I'm going to put in the show notes, where you actually go through this in greater depth. And, this is conservative and these are the kind of weird aspects of it. It almost sounds to me like you're describing more of an activist style of politics. But when you were starting out, it also reminded me of how Whittaker Chambers, the author of Witness, the great mid-20th century spy novel. It's not a novel, it's a true story. But he hated the term conservative. He said, don't call me a conservative. He said, I'm a man of the right. But yes. I don't think that was the same kind of right that you're talking about today. And so I wonder, given your experience at National Review, and for those listeners who don't know, that's the flagship right of center conservative outlet, like that's the top of the mountain. JJ had a column in the top of the mountain in the conservative movement. And so you've been inside the mothership. What do they think there? How have their views changed? With respect to Trump, but also with respect to conservatism and the concepts of the right?
Well, I mean, I don't want to speak for National Review. I'm not with them anymore. I mean, I had a good time when I was there. I was writing a weekly or even twice a week column for them for about a year or so. So the National Review is, I suppose, reflective of certain trends in conservatism in sort of the Trumpist sort of era. And I think that that's been a direction of basically sort of pragmatism and sort of cautious, constructive engagement and, an attempt at sort of like what you sometimes hear, the calling of balls and strikes as a term, as it relates to what the government is or isn't doing. National Review, of course, famously ran their Never Trump sort of cover story, in which you had a lot of sort of the leading lights of the conservative movement circa 2016, sort of denouncing Trump for basically, a whole host of sins, some of which were moral, some of which were ideological. And I think that Trump in power has invited a bunch of different reactions from those types of people. And it's actually interesting to go back and see that Never Trump masthead and sort of see where all those people have sort of wound up. Some of them, like Glenn Beck, have just become enthusiastic, like very aggressive Trump supporters. And then others have become sort of never Trumpers who have then sort of drifted into basically the Democrat coalition. And then some of them are just kind of, like middle of the road, where they would sort of say, well, Trump has done some things I agree with and some things I don't agree with. And sort of viewing Trump as a kind of an instrument who can be useful in the pursuit of certain conservative policies, but, might do bad things in other ways and, be judged on that basis. The challenge for a publication like National Review and many other sort of conservative publications that are trying to keep the flame of a certain sort of conservatism alive is just whether or not there is any public demand, whether or not there's any market demand for that style of engagement. In an era of sort of polarized politics, and in an era sort of defined by a figure as polarizing as Trump, who elicits such great reaction in one direction or the other, I think it's kind of difficult to create a market based on, sometimes criticizing Trump and sometimes supporting Trump, because in a polarized climate, either of those takes will alienate a huge chunk of the potential audience. It feels like, the more sort of successful business model has just been to go all in one way or the other, particularly on the right, to just go all in Trump apologia and sort of boosting Trump, celebrating Trump in a way that I think is often not, particularly intellectually robust, is not particularly principled, and feels just much more like a kind of exercise in sort of PR, or just kind of like boosting him or justifying him, starting from the perspective that like Trump is popular, Trump is good, we should support Trump, and then working back from that conclusion, as opposed to, I think, what some of the more principled conservatives are at least trying to do, which is, to say, this is my set of principles and I'm going to judge Trump based on that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned principles, and you've been quite open about your anti-Americanism. And so I'm
Yes.
wondering how you are feeling lately, where it is now un-Canadian if you are not anti-American.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely difficult because, a lot of my political identity, and always has been defined by a willingness to push back against the anti-Americanism that I think has always defined Canadian identity and Canadian culture. To the extent that there's a distinct Canadian culture, it is defined by a rejection of American things. And I've always had a huge problem with that. I've always sort of liked to think of myself as somebody that takes a principled stance against it, that calls it out for its hypocrisies and the ways in which it's used to justify, I think, bad policy in Canada, sort of bad behavior on the part of individual Canadians and so forth. But that theory of the case has always been based on the premise that America is, not so bad, that America is not, in fact, an enemy of Canada, that America sort of fundamentally wishes Canada well. I do think that is still overwhelmingly the case, but it is obviously the case now that you do have an American administration, or at the very least an American president, who is willing to be belligerent and hostile and vindictive and cruel to this country, and to express a sort of glee in the harms inflicted upon us. And in that context, it does become difficult to do anything approximately standing up for America without also sort of standing up for Trump. And I mean, Canadians, I think rightly, are not in the mood to be hearing from people who are playing defense for America at a time when America has become sort of synonymous with, tariffs and annexation and these sorts of things. So yeah, it's a hard position, and I feel like I'm trying to sort of still kind of figure out what the sort of the correct way to engage is. One thing that I think is important to understand, and I bring this up to my American friends as well, is that I do think it's important to understand that, like, Trump has not made Canadians anti-American from nothing, right? Like I said before, like, anti-Americanism has always been part of Canadian culture. And there is a certain cohort in Canada who I think are always looking for a pretext to ratchet it up even further. So there's always a cohort of just real dyed-in-the-wool anti-Americans in this country who want to say anti-American things all the time, who want to radicalize the country further in the direction of hating and fearing the United States. And I think those people are really sort of taking advantage of this present moment. And I think that it's important to call them out as well, and to ensure that, that people are aware to the degree that they are engaged in an ideological exercise just as much as Trump is.
Yeah, brilliant. The paradox with that anti-Americanism, at least in my mind, is that it seems like the people who are most passionately anti-American are also those who are most colonized ideologically with all of the social and cultural fevers that seem to sweep across America, whether it's DEI or cancel culture or taking a knee in public. As soon as something's happening in America, it's here, and it's the same cohort that hates America that is very proud of their anti-Americanism that accepts those mind viruses. Now, am I right in saying that, or would you?
Well, I mean, I know that this is sort of a line that some conservatives use. I actually am kind of resistant to it. I just think that, I don't like this kind of, I don't know, a la carte anti-Americanism that a lot of Canadians on both the right and the left sort of seem to sort of engage in, right? Where it's like you kind of use anti-Americanism sort of strategically against your enemies when you want to. I mean, the fact is that, Canada and the US have always existed in a common cultural space. And that includes things like philosophy and ideology and sort of political ideas and so on and so forth, right? There's never been a time in Canadian history in which Canada has been sort of like the dominant sort of thought leader of Canadian culture. Big sort of cultural ideas have always originated in the US, and within the context of the US, they've always originated from sort of the big cities of the US, whether that's, New York or California or Chicago or Boston or wherever else, right? These big American cities have always been the sort of ideological incubators of the culture of this continent. And I think that, it's true, like, you could sort of say that big sort of theories of DEI and, modern diversity and postmodern whatever, right? That they originate from many of these big sort of American cities. But there's never really been a time in Canadian history where that's not been the case, right? It's not like there's some sort of like robust, distinct Canadian, tradition of leftism or whatever that originated from, the University of Ottawa or something. And that, it's only in the last couple of weeks that, or a couple of years that we've sort of, sort of swung the things around and are now sort of being colonized by U.S. ideas, right? I mean, it's the same with the conservatism, right? Like when we talk about what is conservative and we sort of think what sort of defines the politics of the principled center right, we do sort of look to, again, sort of the big sort of idea incubators located in the big American cities. And that's just how it is. I mean, that's just how the culture of this continent has always worked. And it's the same is true with, like food culture, fashion culture, entertainment culture, just the inventions that define the rhythm of our daily lives. I make a lot of videos about these questions of sort of American culture and American cultural identity. And I used the adjective American. But as I've also said in some of my other videos, when I talk about American culture, I am sort of thinking of my own culture as well. And it is sort of a uniquely, I think, Canadian thing, or maybe it's not that uniquely Canadian, but definitely people like to think of culture as something that is defined by difference. And I actually think that culture can be defined by commonality. And I think that there's nothing wrong with sort of saying that Canada has an overwhelmingly American culture that is defined by, American cultural innovations and traditions and trends and so forth. You can still be Canadian. You can still identify as Canadian and, enjoy living in this country and all the rest of it, while also acknowledging that a big part of Canadian culture is and has always been, defined by its American fact and American reality.
Yeah, brilliant answer. Holy smokes! Yeah, you've thought through that before. That's no. I'm pumping your tires here now, but that was a really good answer. So we've been dancing around this question or this word for a few minutes now. What does the word conservative mean in Canadian politics?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly since, I guess, the 80s or so, we have, on this continent, again, I would sort of say that we have come with a certain sort of stable definition of conservative that is defined by the preservation of a certain kind of liberal, paradoxically enough, kind of order. I made a video a while ago sort of talking about mid-century liberalism, right? Which was sort of like in the aftermath of the Second World War, you sort of gradually saw the consolidation of what we stood for on this continent as sort of our principled political identity in opposition to fascism and communism, right? And then so as a result, the conservative sort of defines themselves as their loyalty to that system of liberal rights, of individual rights, of democracy, of free market capitalism. In that video about mid-century liberalism, I talked about the way that, say like men like Eisenhower and Diefenbaker would have sort of identified a certain bundle of rights and responsibilities and freedoms as sort of defining what made this part of the world great and free and prosperous and strong and all the rest of it. And I think that conservatism, which was then sort of more articulated as something kind of like distinct, I think, sort of later in the last century, became sort of defined by a willingness to sort of in some ways be more loyal defenders of that order than a left, which was sort of increasingly perceived as being kind of beyond sort of traditional liberalism and towards, I guess, kind of post-liberalism, postmodernism, social democracy that sort of saw just kind of a very inflated role of an activist state as sort of the guiding force that did not have respect for the boundaries imposed by traditional liberalism and traditional liberal institutions like the Constitution, like markets, like individual rights and that kind of stuff. And the idea of a sort of leftist or left-wing, social democrat, whatever progressive instinct that just kind of saw the need for the state to kind of be dominant and sort of the need for dramatic social reform in a way that could run roughshod over sort of liberal rights and sort of traditional liberal notions of restraint over government and over, sort of cultural sort of forces as well. And so I think like that's, if I'm articulating this well enough, I think like that's kind of basically what the conservative tradition has understood itself to be. But like we were talking about before, I think that there are now people that sort of see these kind of like restraints and sort of instincts towards preservation of a certain sort of stable balance as the defining essence of conservatism is no longer interesting to a certain faction of the right and sort of the more reactionary sort of side of the culture that sort of sees the main objective of government is just the complete destruction of the left, and that to not sort of entertain any sort of moderating impulses towards that goal of complete annihilation of a left that they now view as, a domestic enemy that needs to be fought with the same sort of vigor that we would fight a army of foreign invaders or something.
Yeah. So another great answer to an impossibly difficult question. I mean, no one's been able to answer that question very well. Not just me asking, I'm just saying throughout history. One of the professors I had on gave me a 20-minute answer, which was very good. But even then, it was, okay, that's still kind of hard to parse out. Now, my follow-up question would be, do you see conservatism, or what people understand to be conservative, especially as a political label, do you see that shifting now? And the reason I ask that is because many of the things that we assumed were shared ideas, for example, support for pluralism. We were talking about Sean Spear's interview just recently, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, where he said, some of the recent events have really forced us to reassess and reflect on what does a principled support for pluralism mean today in society. But we could throw in other things like people delaying settling down or getting a house, having families, or people not really caring whether they live in this country or another country, or people pulling down statues. And not to say that that's just a feature of the left, but it's a feature of a change in society where I don't think we went through phases like that, where conservatives were forced to say, hang on a second, I don't like what you're doing, but I don't have the words to say why I don't like what you're doing. So do you see a change, or is this just a blip?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to sort of see that maybe there is a degree to which sort of the right-wing sort of like reactionary sort of populism that we see today is the equivalent of the 68ers, it's just in a sort of different direction, that at a time of great sort of social change, there will be reactions to it, and there will be sort of people that, want to push back against it, and often want to push back against it in ways that they're not sort of fully capable of completely articulating in a kind of high-minded intellectual way. There's just a kind of a sense that stuff is changing in ways that I don't really care for.
You've mentioned principles and how things are changing and whether or not conservatism is changing. And yet I've seen you create 2 or 3 excellent videos, and we're going to put them in the show notes as well, about what exactly conservatism means, or what kind of conservative is JJ. So I wonder if you could unpack some of that for listeners.
So one of the ways that I suppose I've sort of understood my political identity and sort of the terms that I use to apply myself uh, is through the sort of the prism of gratitude. You know, when I was growing up, my parents always sort of really sort of pushed this idea on me and my sister that we should be very grateful for the things that we have. You know, the worst sort of sin in the McCullough household was, you know, being sort of like a spoiled brat, right? Like those were the worst sorts of people that were entitled and arrogant and didn't say thank you and didn't respect, you know, the presents that they got at Christmas or, you know, things like whatever, right? And I've kind of feel like I really internalized that, and I kind of like apply that to how I think people should exist in a wealthy, free society of the sort that we have. We have so many wonderful things to be grateful for as citizens of Canada, and I think that we should sort of go through life with a disposition of gratitude and a willingness to sort of stand up and defend the things that make our way of life great, that afford us all to have sort of these wonderful, comfortable lives defined by, you know, a bevy of wonderful things to eat and entertain ourselves with, and, you know, safe streets, and, you know, the right to make content like this and make a living from it by speaking our minds, and all of these kinds of things that sort of flow from, again, like these kind of core principles of that I think were well articulated by the post-war sort of liberal ruling elite, you know, free markets, liberal democracy, all the rest of it, you know, diversity, pluralism, tolerance, all sorts of good things. And so I guess that from a young age, I was always pretty sort of turned off by, certainly by people on the far left who seem to want to promote this idea that like our society sucks and there's nothing good about it and we've never made anything good, and everything that defines sort of modern life is just based on kind of a crude power politics of exploitation and, scamming people and lying to them and propagandizing them and all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, I just found that never to be a very accurate or convincing description of the society that I perceived myself to be living in. Certainly, as well as I've gotten to know sort of more elite people during the course of my life, too, as I've gotten to know, you know, people that are successful in business, people that are at the high ranks in politics or the media. Like, I just have found these people to not be the kind of mustache twisting villains that I definitely think that a lot of kind of far left political theory, and increasingly kind of like far right political theory, posits these people to be. Like that the sort of the people at the highest rungs of our society just kind of like hate the common man and only see them as like, you know, a little sponge to like squeeze things out of and all this. And I've just been very resistant to that. And so in that kind of sense, you know, my mentee makes fun of me because he sort of says like I'm kind of like a status quoist, like I'm just somebody that like worships the status quo and constantly plays defense for it. And I think that that's true on some level. And I think that particularly now in an age of populism and radicalization on both the far left and the far right, somebody has to stand up for the status quo, right? Somebody kind of has to say like, are we not the inheritors of something great? Is it not okay to sort of say that I think things are, you know, things could obviously always be better, but are things not more good than bad? So that's kind of how I sort of come at this. And I definitely think there's an opening for, I think, a little bit more kind of pro-status quo rhetoric. And that's part of the reason why I make a lot of the videos that I do, not just like the political videos, but when I do videos sort of documenting sort of American cultural phenomena, you know, whether that's at the level of consumer goods or whatever else, I do that because I think it's important to remind my audience and remind all of us that we do live in a society that has a lot of good things. And we should go through life sort of appreciating even the little things that make life nice, you know, whether that's, say, your ample collection of books or my ample collection of knickknacks and things that I've collected on my various adventures through life.
Yeah, brilliant answer. And just to be clear, those books are the ones I haven't read. So I'm not,
Of course.
I'm not trying to say I've read all those books. But so I love what you've said. And in many ways, I would think of that as a very Canadian answer. And now I'm going to push you a tiny bit, maybe make you a little bit uncomfortable. But I know you've already gone in this direction anyways. So it's great to be grateful. And it's great to describe what we're grateful for. However, does gratefulness also include coming to the defense of something that we love? And that's where it really pushes us up against our love of pluralism when we see people who are celebrating atrocities that have happened around the world. Do we say, hey, hang on a second, that's not my idea of the way you should behave? And the reason I ask that is because talking with my libertarian friends, but we share a lot of these friends, they'll say, no, hang on. Yeah, we can't enforce any conception of a shared common good or a shared set of ideas because now we're forcing other people to think the way we think. So is gratitude just a nice feeling, or when does gratitude actually translate into positive, concrete approaches or messages or policy ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I definitely think that this is one of the big sort of struggles of our time. Because there's obviously always been a sort of paradox at the heart of liberal democracy. And I actually made a video talking about this explicitly, some of the paradoxes that are sort of inherent in a democratic society. And one of them is that, if you do have a society defined by tolerance and freedom of speech and so forth, how long does it take before those freedoms just become kind of monopolized by sort of the most toxic forces in your society, who then use these rights afforded to them in a not particularly like grateful way, but just in a kind of exploitative way, where they sort of test the limits of how much the system can endure in the pursuit of their sort of narrow ideological goals, which are often, very destructive and in some cases even hateful, right? Like, I feel like I know what you're kind of alluding to, right? Like, I mean, I've been as disgusted as anybody with some of the extremism that we've seen in the context of the Israel-Palestine sort of situation. And it's very troubling in the same way that I was frankly troubled as a younger man when I saw some of the apologia for like 9/11 terrorists and some of that stuff in the aftermath of the war on terror and all that. But the difficult thing, though, is that I think that what we have seen in the Trump administration is you have seen what trying to ratchet some of that stuff back looks like when carried out at the level of public policy. And I feel like a lot of times, I mean, in that sense, like the Trump administration is very useful, I think, to a lot of conservatives who have kind of always had this kind of dream that if there was just a more aggressive government that kind of actually acted upon some of these principles, maybe we'd be in a better state. But then, you sort of see some of this stuff, like, rounding up people in mass deportations and like putting, like this business with Columbia, sort of like withholding the federal financing for Columbia University and then putting various departments of the university under like federal government receivership to kind of like, go through what they're teaching with a fine-tooth comb. And I don't know, like, and that stuff seems pretty illiberal as well, and kind of in defiance of what I feel like I kind of like believe in and stand for. So I don't know. I mean, it is very difficult. I suppose one thing that I have kind of concluded is that if these kinds of reforms are going to be made to the culture directed by government, there kind of has to be some degree to which there has to be sort of like broad kind of bipartisan buy-in, where you kind of have to get like the principled center left and the principled center right to kind of come together and kind of hash out some sort of consensus-based policies. Because if it's just a matter of like conservatives getting to power and then attempting to use the hammer of the state to kind of beat down the progressive element, like that just triggers a kind of reaction that, makes this not seem like something that's being done for the good of the culture, but being done for the good of one sort of partisan faction of it. And so I do think that there is an opportunity, because I do think that you do see principled people, and I follow a lot of these people on social media, principled people of the center left who are disturbed and bothered by what is being done by the further left. They're not interested in sort of the Trumpist solution, but they are pretty irritated with some of the excesses of their own side. And to me, that sort of suggests that if America was in a somewhat different sort of political moment, if it had a somewhat more pragmatic kind of center-right government, I think that in the aftermath, particularly not just of the Israel-Palestine stuff, but like sort of the excesses of the Great Awakening era in general, I feel like you could imagine another context in which you could kind of have a sort of like broad kind of coalition that could kind of come together and sort of rediscover principled liberalism and rediscover what we do stand for and where the limits of, what are the kind of lines that we can all agree you should not cross, and what sort of you know, public policy solutions could be dreamed up to impose some sort of, you know, corrective measures for dealing with this kind of thing. But as it stands now, I just think that we're a long way away from that kind of like utopian consensus approach to public policy. It seems to me much more likely that when conservatives get in charge, they will just sort of seek to go after, to use the power of the state to kind of go after their ideological enemies, whether that's in the universities or the media or whatever else. And then, you know, when the progressives get back in charge, they'll just undo all of that stuff. And so it's just, I don't know, maybe in some respects, this is kind of what modern politics is going to be defined by, this kind of ratcheting of back and forth and sort of this policing of different exercises of freedoms like freedom of speech and association and all the rest of this. And as different ideological tribes get in power, you know, they have different metrics of what is going too far, and then thus what the state is justified in correcting.
Yeah. So as you were talking, I remembered what we were talking about when we got cut off, and I was just in the process of apologizing for asking you to give me a definition of what is JJ McCullough's type of conservatism, or what does that word mean, and is that word changing? So part of me wants to say, yes, it's impossible, and therefore it's kind of impractical to spend all our time obsessing about definitions. Having said that, I think one of the hypotheses I have for this podcast is that there is a difference between conservatism and liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And Roger Scruton, you know, peace be upon him, just passed away recently. He, one of the great conservative philosophers of our era, said that conservatism is a work of rescue. Mm-hmm. And he also said that conservative intellectuals are people who find or look for reasons for people who don't need reasons. And I think we're at a moment where we're trying to find language to talk about things that you've mentioned, you know, how can the reasonable people on the left and the reasonable people on the right, and how can we have a dialogue? Okay, so that's describing something that I would think of as a conservative inclination or a conservative principle. And your comments about, well, we don't want to be the right that's just mean and trying to tear things down. They're just they're the other side of the coin from the things we're complaining about on the left. I think there's a need for us to be able to put meat on this idea of just do what your grandma said, right? Just smarten up. Does that resonate at all? Or
I think it does, and I think it sort of suggests that some of this is going to play out on sort of an individual level, right? Like, I mean, when I go about my life, I have a lot of younger friends, you know, being a sort of single guy in his 40s, right? Like, I think your friendships start to sort of turn younger because, you know, these are other sort of single people that want to hang out with you. And, you know, it sort of resulted in me being in a lot more sort of like mentor type relationships with younger men. And then sort of, I kind of think about like, well, how to handle myself, particularly at a time when we know that a lot of sort of younger men are kind of getting radicalized in one direction or another. And then so a lot of it just kind of comes down to like, as older people, are we sort of able to model a kind of like responsible, moderate sort of disposition in life, even a sort of conservative, grateful disposition in life, you know, just kind of carry yourself and model that. And I suppose people that have children have to think about this in my age, who are sort of raising their kids and sort of how they're choosing to impart sort of certain values, how you, and any sort of person of responsibility, you know, myself as a YouTuber, I sort of think about this, you know, I'm not running like a preachy political channel, but, you know, I make videos that talk about political themes, and I think about sort of the kind of behavior that I'm modeling to my audience, not just as a YouTuber, but as a man. So I don't know. I mean, it's a complex sort of social problem, and I think it's going to require complex sort of social solutions. I mean, I don't have I don't have great answers to this, I think, any more than anybody does. But I definitely am sort of sensitive to the idea that, like, I think like mentoring has to play a role. And I also think that people like myself, who are sort of like in this kind of like new media space, have to think about how they carry themselves, the kind of behavioral attitudes that they model. Because I think, surprisingly enough, a lot of even people that are on, television or YouTube, I should say, on social media all the time, they think a lot about the sort of content that they make. Like that's the big term that we use a lot, is like content, make the video, how many views does it hit, blah, blah, blah. But they don't think enough about themselves as sort of potential role models for their audiences. And I definitely think that there's kind of a sort of dearth of people in this space thinking sort of seriously about themselves as people modeling a certain kind of lifestyle and disposition to a young and influential audience.
That was a very profound answer. And again, it sounds like I'm just pumping your tires, but this is what freaked me out about. So I'll have to tell people how I found JJ McCullough. I was doing some research on the Canadian Constitution, and I thought, what? This isn't, the British North America Act isn't our Constitution, and patriating our Constitution, or repatriating it, as people I think incorrectly call it, with the first Trudeau government. And then, so I found your video on the Constitution, and here's this guy with, it looks like he's 21 and bouncing around, and a really high energy video talking about incredibly difficult, challenging, profound topics. The difference between an unwritten constitution, which is what Canada has, and a written constitution, English common law versus continental law, and yet packaging it in a way that it was fun to consume. And you're a paradox, JJ. And so how did you get into this? What drew JJ McCullough? Like, these are hard concepts, and yet you're packaging them in super exciting, friendly ways that clearly there's a huge audience for. What drew you into this?
Well, thank you, Sean. That's very kind. I like communication. I've always liked communication. I think I've sort of come to realize that's one of the other sort of great passions of my life. I like communicating complex topics. I like trying to communicate from a position of sort of confident knowledge, and communicating sort of fact-based information in a way that's sort of frank and sort of sincere and conversational in some ways. There's nothing better, I think, than listening to a good interview with somebody who knows what he's talking about, to read a book that's sort of written in a very sort of like succinct, clear prose. I've always been sort of most sort of seduced by people and writing that is sort of done in that way. And so I kind of feel like I always wanted to be that sort of person. In whatever form it took. I've drawn, cartoons over the years. I've done lots of writing over the years. I've been a guest on television shows and stuff. And, now I'm making videos. And so it's always been animated by that desire to just kind of like communicate clearly and bluntly and honestly. I think I've always been very interested in Canada, Canadian things, Canadian identity, Canadian institutions. It's been a big sort of passion of my life as well. And I guess I've always sort of felt like, I suppose I felt two things. I've felt that a lot of Canadian information is not communicated well or clearly, and that's a big sort of deficiency. And I've also always kind of felt that a lot of people are very interested in Canadian things in a way that we assume they are not. And this goes for not just Canadians themselves, but Americans, international audiences. And so I guess I kind of always figured that, if I made a YouTube channel that spent a lot of time talking about Canadian things in a clear and honest and a sort of unvarnished way, that it would be popular. And it has been, not just with Canadians, but with a global audience as well. And I'm very happy to say that in contrast to what our federal government tends to believe, I've been able to do it without any dime of government funding or support or subsidies. I haven't required any Bill C-11s to kind of rig the algorithm in my favor. Canadian content and Canadian cultural analysis, political analysis, it can survive perfectly well in a free market. And I'm very proud of myself that I've been able to do that, in part for, sorry to say, kind of somewhat sort of shallow political reasons, because it's been useful for my own political ideology to demonstrate that a lot of the conventional wisdom about how, what the market will or will not support when it comes to Canadian content is just false, that there is a way to do it. And I think it requires, without patting myself on the back too much, it requires some of the approach that I've taken, a desire to be kind of honest about some of these things and to sort of speak in a kind of clear and concise and hopefully insightful way, rather than to just kind of regurgitate a lot of the conventional wisdom or tell these stories the same way that everybody does.
Yeah. Well, you pull it off as though you're just making a comment here or there, and it's not. It's totally thought out. You have a plan. Anyways, the post-production work that you do on your videos, it's like you're the prof that is teaching Greek philosophy and jumps up on the desk and everybody listens to you or what. Anyways, so you've figured it out, and I haven't figured you out, and so that's why I asked the question. But I wanted to pivot from there to get your thoughts on Pierre Poilievre, if you have time for that. What are your thoughts on him? What kind of conservative is he? And will we ever know, or is he just playing things so safe because he's in an election period? So do you have some reflections on Poilievre?
Yeah, so I mean, I've met Poilievre a few times. I've had conversations with him. He's always sort of struck me as being the real deal, so to speak, in the sense that I think he's a very orthodox conservative. I think he's a very orthodox ideological conservative. I think that he sort of came to his worldview when he was quite young, and I don't really sort of think it's bent much over the years. And so I think that that can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in the sense that I think he is principled, and I think if he becomes prime minister, he will be going into that office with a real action plan of problems he wants to solve, a sort of sense of what Ottawa is doing wrong and what the course correction should be. But, the downside of that is, I suppose, twofold. One is that, any ideologue can be pretty stubborn. Facts sort of change reality, but if your worldview is very fixed, you might be a little sort of lack the kind of nimbleness that I think a good prime minister sometimes needs. And then the other thing too is just, kind of getting to what we've been talking about and what you've talked about many times on with some of your other guests is the kind of orthodox sort of conservative worldview that Pierre sort of internalized as a young age in the 90s or whatever. Is that still the worldview that is most relevant for the challenges we face in the year 2025? And I think if Pierre does become prime minister, that will be interesting because, there's definitely like a populist side to him, as much as we've all seen that famous video of him with the apple, where he's very resistant to people sort of drawing analogies between populism and Trump and all the rest of it and him. There's obviously some parallels there that can be drawn. But it's also the case that just unlike some of the other right-wing populists in other sort of Western democracies, he is still very loyal to, this kind of 90s, 80s era kind of conservative orthodoxy, conservative conventional wisdom about tax cuts and deregulations and shrink the size of government and, free trade and all of these kinds of things, right? And so his election, if he does become prime minister, it will be interesting because it will serve as a kind of case study as to whether or not there is still something to be said for that approach to politics. I could see a world in which if he is prime minister, that a lot of Americans will like him, perhaps even more than they will like Trump, a lot of conservative Americans, I should say, because they will see his government as being more disciplined and consistently ideological and principled and sort of focused and, just more competent, I suppose you could sort of say. And then Trump's kind of like more chaotic, kind of like harder right, but also kind of like less experienced and less sort of professionalized administration. So it's an important case study for the future of that flavor of conservatism on this continent. And I definitely think that if he loses, then we're really starting to get into kind of like weird uncharted territory. Because if he cannot make this work, the sort of person that I think would be elected to replace him, I think there's a very real danger that at that point you would get, as head of the Conservative Party of Canada, a real sort of like right-wing kind of conspiracy kind of crackpot type, I'm sorry to say. So I think that that's definitely a danger that we should be on guard against.
Yeah, another good answer for sure. I guess I agree with what you've said. It sounds like Poilievre is giving out that vibe, that 1980s kind of, it's almost a National Review, Jonah Goldberg the old Jonah Goldberg kind of vibe. And I'm hoping he's successful with that. Certainly seems to have a ton of support. And I'm just wondering whether or not he's also able to tap into the J.D. Vance hillbilly elegy kind of vibe, not his Catholic integralism, but his sense of, a lot of people are really, really hurting in our country.
Mm.
And yes, we want trade, but we want good trade deals. We don't just want to say we want free trade as an ideological position. So that's where I'm wondering whether conservatism is shifting. Certainly it's shifting in the States. I think it's shifting in Canada, but I haven't been able to put language to it. And I've asked you about 4 times to try to commit yourself, and I'm not going to ask you again,
Yeah.
but that's where I'm wondering. But I wanted to finish by saying, what am I not asking you? So it's the problem with this is that, I'm driving all these questions and really I could be so far off the target. It's ridiculous. So what keeps you awake at night, or what are you planning for your next 10 videos? What do people need to be thinking about?
That's an interesting question. I am thinking a lot about sort of pluralism, diversity, that kind of thing. I think is one of the big sort of defining challenges of our time. You just brought up J.D. Vance, sort of one thing that he is very partial to, and I do think it sort of transitions into some of the hillbilly elegy kind of theory of the world, like you were sort of referencing, is he has started kind of going around saying this line that's very popular in parts of the American right wing, not so much the conservative wing, which is the idea that like America is not an idea. America is a nation. America is a people. America is a land, right? And that is, that's a very provocative thing to say because it is very post-liberal in a way. It's sort of saying that America is not defined by its democratic institutions, its constitution, its sort of promises or its ideas. It's defined by, a kind of sense that there are people who belong here and there are people that have a claim to this land, and that there are some people that have more of a claim to this land than others. And sort of, his hillbilly elegy thesis has kind of mutated as his political sort of identity for himself has mutated. But sort of like the one thing that has seemed relatively consistent is this kind of like romantic notion that there are like these multi-generational American families who have lived in the same place for a very long period of time. They have completely lost any sort of sense of their connection to Europe or England or wherever, and are just defined as Americans in this very pure kind of way. He talks about, the 7 generations of the Kentucky family being buried in the same graveyard. And the kind of sense that like, those are like the true Americans, the heritage Americans. He had an interview recently where a woman was, the interviewer was saying something about like America is like a nation of immigrants, and Vance is like, well, some Americans were not immigrants, they were colonists, right? Like that they were sort of like the people that settled and made the country, as opposed to just kind of like newcomers who have sort of assimilated into that country that they made. And I don't really like this sort of theory of America because I think it's ahistorical in all sorts of ways. But it's definitely a sort of theory that is growing in popularity on the American right. And Charlie Kirk, who's one of the sort of most influential right-wingers, certainly more influential than National Review, I'm sorry to say. He has a book out right now called Right Wing Revolution. It's a book that I think is definitely worth reading, just because I think it is one of the most sort of clearest articulations of this kind of like modern right in the context of sort of Trump's America. And one sort of theme that really kind of like comes through with that book is that sort of the project of the American right, in his mind, is sort of a reinforcing of a certain hierarchy of who makes up America. That there are sort of some people who are kind of have always been on the top, and it's probably proper for them to be on the top. And then there's sort of people, minority groups that, have wound up on the bottom and should kind of properly be there, right? And to me, that's an idea that I'm very turned off by as well. I'm not just a white guy, but I'm also a gay man myself. And so I've always kind of come through life with this sort of sense of where I kind of fit in or don't fit in. And certainly any sort of worldview that posits that the correct place for people like myself is to sort of be several rungs lower than the people that are destined to always be in charge of everything kind of grinds against me in an uncomfortable way. But I do sort of think a lot about like, well, what is the best way to articulate sort of principled opposition to this sort of post-liberal notion of nationhood? Because it's definitely very present in Canada as well, right? Not just in terms of our old buddies in Quebec and how they sort of conceptualize what what their nation is, which is definitely not a nation defined by an idea. But, you see this in aspects of like the Canadian right as well, right? When you sort of see the crew, for example, that are constantly defending the red ensign flag, right? One of the reasons why they're loyal to that is because they feel like that was a flag that sort of symbolized a kind of hierarchical notion of who this country was for. You look at the old red ensign flag, we have the British Union Jack, and then we have this little crest that shows like the Irish, the Scots, the French, and the English, right? And the idea that Canada is a country fundamentally for those people. Like this country is not a nation of ideas. It is a nation state that was created in the image and for a certain group of people. And so I'm just kind of like very sort of fascinated and sort of provoked by sort of people that engage with modern North American politics in that way, in that kind of reactionary way, in an attempt to sort of like reassert a kind of cultural hierarchy at a time when both Canada and the US have become more visibly defined by their diversity and by their status as, the most immigrant welcoming nations on earth than ever before. And so I'm still kind of thinking through exactly how I want to engage with it, but it's definitely the topic that is probably the most fascinating to me in our modern political moment.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I find maybe paradox, not the right word. Hypocrisy, not the right word. Anyways, it's incongruent. When you look at Anglo culture, England is a blend of everything from around the world, right? They have tea and scarves and silk and the music, and it's just a mishmash of everything. And that's what made the original Anglo or British approach to culture so great. The English language has got Greek and Latin and Old English and Germanic words, and it's just everything. Oh, that's a good word. We're going to steal it. We're going to use it. And so it's like the epitome of cultural appropriation, right? But yet that shows a curiosity and a willingness to say, oh, that's great, that's great, that's great, and as opposed to saying, oh, I'm better than you because I'm from this descendant line. So I find it's really weird because you're bragging about Anglo culture, but do you even understand Anglo culture? I don't know. Maybe they're bragging about some other kind of cultural basis. I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned post-liberal, and I know a lot of people are really upset about the post-liberal ideas because they don't like where some of the integralists are taking things, or like you've just described, right, where my culture's naturally better than yours in some weird hierarchy that kind of makes my skin crawl a bit. But if you read like Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, who Barack Obama said it was a great book, right? So on the left, he said, okay, yeah, some of the core principles of liberalism is failing because it was so successful. Because it was so successful at championing freedom, equality, universal ideas, and the notion that we can improve, we can progress in our approach to government, etc. Because it was so good, it started to crumble. And even Francis Fukuyama, like the high priest of modern liberalism, has written his book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. And he says, no, hang on, this hyper-individualism is an exaggeration of the original liberal ideas. But in making that connection, he's essentially saying, yeah, the reason we're in this weird, screwed up space is because of liberalism itself. And I think liberalism was great because it assumed a thicker culture, like we said earlier, the stuff you learned from your grandma, stand in line, tell the truth, be grateful, don't be a spoiled bum. So all those things were what held you and me together, so that I didn't, go in your house, even though the door was unlocked. I didn't walk in your house. I knew that's your castle, that's your property. So all these ideas that held us together so we could get along and not hurt each other and do business together, high trust society. And then liberalism was the political philosophy that floated on top of that thicker substructure. Whereas if you take liberalism to its extreme, then it, by nature, just by what it is, tends to tear apart that substructure and says, well, what right does grandma have to tell me what to do? And what right do you have to tell me to stand in line? And it's kind
Yes.
of more of a screw you attitude when it's taken to its extreme. So our challenge, I think, is for us to get language. Again, Roger Scruton, a work of rescue. We have to rescue that. And I think conservatism is the word that we're supposed to be using. Now, my libertarian friends would say, no, it's just non-coercion. Libertarianism is the way to go.
Yeah.
But is it, does that freak you out to hear someone say, well, maybe there is some truth in some of the post-liberal writing that's out there, but now it's being taken to an extreme? Or what thoughts come to mind with that?
I mean, it doesn't freak me out as such. Like, I think it's perfectly healthy to critique liberalism and to, offer the sort of analysis that you've described these people as offering, which is true. It doesn't come from a sort of always from a hostile sort of reactionary place. It just comes from a sort of thoughtful, eyes open kind of analytic place. The problem just, though, that it always seems to come back to is just, what can the state do to address these concerns? And again, I feel like you see the Trump administration trying to address some of these concerns in a kind of very heavy-handed, aggressive way. It doesn't, I mean, there are people, I think, who are in the Trump administration who are sort of actively sinister figures. But I think there's also people that are, well-meaning and sort of take these kind of critiques seriously. And maybe they've become a few more steps radicalized in the process. But, they have a sort of sense that, liberalism has gone too far, sort of our tolerance and acceptance have led to sort of weird deformities in the culture on the college campuses or wherever, and that therefore, a sort of strong hand is needed to sort of correct things, and that maybe this is tough medicine, but in the long term, we'll all be better off for consuming it. And it just seems to me that, I don't know, that approach just doesn't seem like it's going to work, right? It just seems like this is not something that is going to be resolved with one government, one party, one administration, just through executive orders, kind of righting the ship, right? It's going to be something that's going to be much more complicated and difficult to do. And I think it's going to require a sort of a broader kind of coalition that is less visibly animated by reactionary impulses and hatreds, and a more, like you kind of alluded to, a more sort of preserving sort of impulse, an impulse towards preservation and respect for what has come before, but also sort of defining what has come before in maybe a more sort of conciliatory way, right? Understanding what has come before as a sort of type of pluralism and diversity, not this thing that we were talking about before, this kind of romantic idea that there was this perfect hierarchy defined by, a pure culture at the top, and, everybody else knew their place and were kept in small enough numbers that they didn't threaten the cultural dominance of this one group over others. So, yeah. I don't know. It's just, I feel, I struggle sometimes because on the one hand, I don't want to be just some sort of yapper who all he can do is kind of come up with highfalutin sort of theories to explain the present moment. But on the other hand, I do feel, and I think everybody should sort of feel a little humbled by the Trump administration's sort of attempts to kind of address some of these things. And you sort of see, it's like this on so many issues, I find. I mean, I felt the same way about, frankly, abortion, right? Where it's sort of you think of yourself as, I've always sort of thought of myself as being, more pro-life than not. But then at the same time, you sort of see, well, what does it look like when you have a government that is trying to enforce pro-life policies? And then you sort of see, well, okay, I don't really like this either, and this is off-putting too. So I think it's always, even a bad government can be very useful in the sense that it humbles you. It teaches you what it looks like to bring your ideas into practice. And I guess that makes me sometimes think that, well, maybe we do need to spend a bit more time just yapping sometimes before we start, grabbing the levers of the state and pulling things and trying to solve these problems that we've maybe only half correctly diagnosed.
Yeah. I guess it turns me right back to your very successful YouTube channel. I think the answer in large part lies in doing the things that you're doing and thinking about, what kind of a person am I? What kind of persona and approach are you able to project? And it's no good if we just do that while we're reading our books in our office. We're going to have to get out and interact. John von Heiking's professor at University of Lethbridge. A lot of his work has been done on a philosophy of friendship, right? He's writing books all the time. That's the basis of culture and politics. And I think there's an opportunity there. But anyways, it has been fantastic having you here, JJ. I'm hopeful that we didn't lose a huge chunk when the power went out. And maybe I'll edit out that line, but well, no, I won't. So right in the middle of this, it's very windy where we are, and the power went out right in the middle. And I think it was a way of getting JJ off the hook of having to offer a crisp definition of conservatism. Actually, I think you gave your definition, and then I was challenging it or something. Anyways, it's been fantastic. We'll have links to your show and your articles and anything that you want people to know about. Where can we find you? It's mostly on YouTube?
Yeah, these days, pretty much everything I'm doing is on YouTube. I do have a Substack as well that I occasionally write for, but if people are interested in what I've got to say, I post a video every week on my YouTube channel, so that's probably the best way to stay in touch.
Yeah, brilliant. And I hope what you've done will inspire other people. I could never do anything like what you've done, but that approach of, I think conservatives ignore culture too much and ignore communication, and we don't see it as an important thing to do. So certainly check out JJ's channel and you'll be inspired and maybe do some of that yourself. JJ, thanks again. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. It's a great conversation.